you. I'm really glad to see so many people here today. I'm really excited to talk to you because, the children that I know you all work with are really affected by the work that we do, and we overlap a lot. So I think it'll be great to share some of what we do and some of the information that we have from working with our clients. Oh, wow. Hello, Mr. Martin. That's awesome to see you. Mr. Martin was my history teacher in high school, y'all, which is actually also when I first was involved in the shelter. So I volunteered in high school with a peer education group called Viva, and we worked with both the shelter and the Sexual Assault Resource Agency doing peer education for teenagers on dating violence issues and sexual violence issues. So that's how I got into this work, and I'm very passionate about it, and I'm really excited to be here. So I'm going to just say one more thing, which is that I tend to not be amazing at looking at the chat. So if you have a question lingering that you really are burning to get answered, just unmute yourself and tell me what it is, and I will answer it. I don't mind being interrupted. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and get started. So are you all seeing my sort of splash page? Okay, great. Let me get my, okay. So we're the Shelter for Help in Emergency. We are a domestic violence agency. We're specifically domestic violence. A lot of agencies share sexual violence and domestic violence, but in our area, we're really lucky to have two distinct agencies. Obviously, we work together a lot because our issues overlap, but we do have those resources dedicated to our specific issues, which is great. We serve Albemarle, Charlottesville, Fluvanna, Nelson, Greene, and Louisa counties. So we have a really large service area. And that is about all I'll say about that. But we try and serve them all equally. So I hope that there are people from all of those areas on here today. So just a little orientation for you about what I'm going to talk to you about today and what you can kind of expect to get out of this presentation. We're going to talk about what domestic violence is and who it affects. We're also going to talk about some common myths and misunderstandings about DV. And we're going to talk about the dynamics of domestic violence, what makes it different than other kinds of violence, what makes it difficult to leave abusive relationships and why people stay. We'll also talk about how you can support and advocate for victims, survivors, or in your case, a lot of times children who are witnesses to domestic violence. We'll talk about how it affects children, how we work with families at the shelter, and also what our services are and who our clients are. So just a little terminology to start off with. I'm going to use the terms domestic violence and intimate partner violence pretty interchangeably. That is a language evolution thing. So kind of started as the battered women's movement, and then we moved to domestic violence. And we've been moving towards this term intimate partner violence as a more inclusive term for people who may not be in traditional marriages or are in same-sex relationships or just dating, because these issues are experienced by people who aren't just married. It's sort of all over that spectrum. So I want to start by having you just think about what are your preconceptions about domestic violence and intimate partner violence. What comes to your mind when you hear those words? For a lot of people, it's a woman with a black eye, or it's that picture of physical suffering, which is definitely part of it. But there are also a lot of socially constructed notions about what is and isn't domestic violence, and some of those are probably going to be challenged today. We deal with physical violence, but we also deal with a lot of other kinds of domestic violence that don't maybe involve physical abuse. So our working definition of domestic violence is a pattern of physically, sexually, and or emotionally abusive behaviors by one individual that are intended to maintain power and control over a partner in the context of an intimate relationship. And I want to just draw attention to that pattern of power and control. That's really the defining aspect of abuse, is that it's a pattern of behaviors that creates a power imbalance, and is, the goal of it is to create a power imbalance and give all control in the relationship to the abusive partner. I also want to emphasize that it can happen to anyone, regardless of race, age, sexual orientation, religion, gender, socioeconomic status. We see that it happens in same-sex relationships, in opposite-sex relationships. It happens in dating relationships, married relationships, people who are living together and not living together. So there's really no demographic that kind of insulates you from the possibility of going through domestic violence. And I think it's also important in this to note that it does affect everyone, but one pattern that we notice is that when people identify as a member of, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to change that slide, as a member of a community that is traditionally disempowered. So maybe people of color, women, immigrant communities, differently able people. So, people who maybe have a physical disability or a mental disability, we see that the rates of domestic violence in those communities are higher. So if you're part of a group that is already socially disempowered, unfortunately, we see that your risk level goes up. So some quick stats, 1 in 4 women will experience intimate partner violence in her lifetime. The analogous statistic for men is 1 in 9. So this definitely affects all genders, but our clientele are primarily women. Just in terms of like the facts on the ground, it is still an issue that affects women at a higher rate than men. 33% of all homicides in Virginia are domestic violence related. So that one I include because it's terrible. And it is one of the reasons that our work is so important, because a lot of what we're trying to do is interrupt that cycle of violence before it becomes a homicide. Women aged 18 to 24 experience the highest per capita rate of intimate partner violence. So it does affect people quite young, and hence the peer education in high school. It's actually really important to teach people what are the dynamics of a healthy relationship, how to take care of themselves early, because they are likely to experience this quite early. And the other thing that we see is that often it is a generational cycle. So people who grew up with domestic violence in their family are more likely to have to experience it, unfortunately, again, as an adult, because it's a learned behavior on both sides. So it's a learned behavior from the people who perpetrate it, and it's also a learned behavior for the people who experience it, that they start to have a normal that is not normal. And so their baseline needs a little help. And so we try and get in there and talk about like what they can expect and should be expecting from a healthy relationship. 1 in 15 children are exposed to intimate violence each year, and 90% of these children are eyewitnesses to this violence. So that is probably very pertinent to the children that you're working with, that 55% of your clientele. This is also a personal statistic for me. So one of the reasons I'm so interested in this work and feel so passionately about it is that my stepfather, who is a very, very close parent to me, grew up in a very abusive household. And I saw the effects of that trauma on him as an adult. And I'm very lucky in that he had done a lot of work and did not pass on that violence. He went the other way. But I still saw how much that affected him throughout his life. And it became really important to me to interrupt that cycle, that generational cycle. So what are some of the types of violence used by abusers? Physical, sexual, emotional, economic, and psychological, right? So we often think of the physical first. It's a lot of times the most visible evidence And it is often what we envision as like the highest escalation of violence. That's when it becomes dangerous in terms of potential homicide and things like that. But a lot of what we work with is, other kinds of violence as well. And it may not include physical. So we have a lot of clients who are experiencing an emotional abuse. Economic abuse can mean one partner controls all of the finances. It can also mean that they are maybe sort of purposefully ruining opportunities for that person to be financially self-sufficient. So making it impossible for them to work or harming their credit intentionally. Things that make that person more dependent on the abuser. And all of these behaviors, whether they're physical or not, can intimidate, they manipulate, they can be threatening, and they just consolidate that control with the one partner. So these are just some quick examples of different categories. The physical, I think we're pretty familiar with. Usually that's punching, kicking, any kind of, hitting, threatening with weapons. Financial, I just went over. The emotional abuse a lot of times looks like public humiliation, constant insults, jealousy that is controlling, so isolation from friends and family, and also gaslighting, so saying that minimizing the abuse or saying that the victim is making it up, that it's their fault, things like that. And then with sexual violence, we do see that there's significant overlap, and a lot of domestic violence situations have sexual violence in them, and that is one of the tactics of abuse. Another behavior we see a lot that we consider a very high danger behavior is stalking. So that is defined as repeated unwanted attention, contact, or harassment directed at a specific person to intentionally create fear of harm or death. And a lot of times this stalking will happen when someone is attempting to leave an abusive relationship. The stalking, though, is also related to the level of control over someone's whereabouts and behaviors that the abuser has within the relationship. So it can almost start when someone is checking all of your phone calls, when someone is needs to know where you are at all times, right? These aren't normal behaviors, and it's sort of predictive of stalking. So how do we identify abusive behaviors? We have a tool that's been used in domestic violence work for a very long time called the Power and Control Wheel. It was created in the beginning of the battered women's movement, which is what it was called then, in Duluth, Minnesota. And it came out of a bunch of interviews with both survivors and perpetrators of domestic violence to talk about like what were the behaviors that characterized the situation and that resulted in the abuser having all of the control in the relationship. And so what we came up with was, a series of different behaviors that sort of all created this power imbalance. And it's a really useful tool when we're working with clients who maybe don't recognize that they're in an abusive relationship, because they'll look at these behaviors and start to see, maybe there's maybe their partner is using threats and emotional abuse and economic abuse. Maybe they are isolating them from friends and family, preventing them from doing things that they used to enjoy, going to church, isolating them from any supportive community that might be able to help them maintain power in their personal relationship is a behavior we see a lot. So this list can be really useful just in exploring what are the ways in which that abuser is maintaining control in a relationship so that we can get in and kind of help interrupt that specific dynamic. I like to include this wheel too, which is what it would look like in a healthy relationship, right? So whereas In an abusive relationship, we'll see isolation from family and friends. Um, in a healthy relationship, we would see someone supporting someone's interests, supporting their involvement in communities that make them happy, right? Whereas we would see maybe some threats and coercive behavior in a violent relationship. In a healthy relationship, we're going to see fairness, negotiation. If your partner is doing something that you'd prefer them not to do, there's going to be a discussion around that, maybe a compromise, but not a threat that if they do this, there will be dangerous consequences for them. We see economic partnership. That doesn't always look like both partners making the same amount of money, but it does look like both partners having decision-making powers about how they're going to conduct their financial life and what they want to use their money towards, and how they want to earn their money, things like that. And we see, responsible parenting where both partners are sort of centered on the child's well-being. They're not using children as weapons against one another. They're not bad-mouthing each other to the children, and they're not threatening to take children away, right? So in a lot of abusive relationships, we see that the abuser will use the children they'll weaponize children. So they'll say, if you don't do X, I'm going to call CPS and tell them that you're abusing our children. Or if you leave me, you'll never get custody, they'll never believe you, and you'll never see your kids again. So there's a lot of, when people have children in a domestically violent relationship, it can make leaving far more complicated. And it is also often, unfortunately, part of the abuse. So when we work with families, we're getting into those dynamics pretty heavily to figure out how to interrupt that cycle. And actually, one other thing about using children, we do see in our clientele, often there's a really, really strong fear that they will be reported to CPS or that their children will be taken away. And that comes from their abuser. And it also makes them very reticent to seek services. So one of the things that we really try and emphasize with our clients who have children is that, seeking services with us, while it does identify you as being in a domestically violent relationship, is really seen quite positively, because you're taking actions to keep your children safe. You're taking actions to keep yourself safe. And, we work with women with the assumption that, and men, we work with our clients with children with the assumption that they're working towards trying to create a healthier, safer environment for their children. And we're going to do everything in our power to help them to do that. So we work really collaboratively to try and construct a safe space for their children. So what are some common signs of abuse? I imagine that you all maybe know some of this from working with the children that you work with, right? So a lot of them are the same. When the people you love or who are supposed to care for you are not doing that, we see some typical behaviors. So sudden changes in mood or personality, withdrawal from social interactions or relationships with others where you previously enjoyed them. Sudden changes in the way someone dresses, acts, or thinks can indicate that their partner is having kind of an abnormal influence on who they are or who they express themselves to be. If someone seems like they have to always check in with their partner, or are a little bit afraid or anxious about their reactions when trying to make independent plans, that's not a good sign. Obviously, any physical signs of abuse, bruises, cuts, or clothing that looks like it's intended to cover up those things is a big sign that something not okay is going on. And then if anybody, who used to be kind of a confident, happy-go-lucky person is all of a sudden having real self-esteem problems, questioning their worth, that can often mean that somebody in their life is pushing them to do so with some emotional abuse. So that's one of the things we see a lot, is that emotional abuse and psychological abuse takes a huge toll on people's sense of value and worth and what they deserve. And so a lot of what we're undoing is often years and years of being emotionally abused, and trying to build that person up so that they believe and know that they're a person who has value in the world, who does not deserve to be mistreated, and that nobody deserves to be abused. So even if they're not perfect, that's not an excuse for the behavior that they're receiving from an abusive partner. So this is a question we get all the time and our clients get all the time. And anybody who's ever been in an abusive relationship gets all the time. Why did you stay? Why does she stay? Why doesn't he leave? Why? If it's so awful, how are they still there? And there are a lot of issues that feed into this. So one of them is the cycle of violence. We see a pretty typical cycle that escalates over time in abusive relationships. And we think of it in 3 phases. Usually people come to us in the crisis phase. And this is when there's been a big blow up. There's a fight. It's really bad. There's threats. Maybe there's physical violence. The client is afraid for their safety. A lot of times this phase is exacerbated by substance use, so alcohol or drug use. And it's really scary. And that is when people tend to reach out for help. So a lot of times people will come to us in that crisis phase. Maybe the police have been called, and so they'll come into shelter or they'll come into services then. But usually the crisis phase is fairly immediately followed by what some people call the honeymoon phase, or we refer to as the calm phase. And that is in some ways one of the most difficult parts of the abuse, because it's when you're receiving loving behaviors. It's when you see the person with whom you fell in love and they are making you feel special, and they're complimenting you and they're apologizing for the behavior and saying it'll never happen again. Maybe they're going to church and they're saying they'll find Jesus. Maybe they're going to AA and they quit the substance use for a little bit. And there's this effort to draw the person back into the relationship. And it can often feel and look quite genuine. And perhaps it even is. But what we see is that it usually then scales back up into this tension phase, where the situation feels like a little more volatile, and our clients feel like they're walking on eggshells, and they feel like if they do anything wrong, it might kind of tip it into violent behavior again. And they're a little scared and tentative, and they're not receiving those loving behaviors anymore, and they're just waiting for the next shoe to drop. So the thing about this cycle is that as soon as the crisis phase happens and that person maybe is ready to leave, or they're like, this, I can't handle this anymore, it's too scary, they receive this sort of invitation back invitation to believe all the things that they want to believe, that it's going to get better, that they can change this person. And it can be very, very seductive. And it's also difficult to leave your primary relationship in any circumstances. So it gives them an excuse to stay if they're worried about money, if they're worried about being judged by their religious community. All of these things, when it looks like maybe it's going to get better, can be very convincing. And so what we see is that it takes the majority of intimate partner violence survivors 7 to 12 times to leave an abusive relationship for the final time. And that's just, so we work with a lot of repeat clients. We work with people in different stages of trying to leave. And our goal is always to keep them the safest that we can keep them in the situation that they're choosing at that time. So, obviously, if we can safely plan with them to get out of the relationship, that's going to be in a lot of ways the best result. But there are a lot of reasons that they may not want to do that. Fear is one of them. So when someone leaves an abusive relationship, it is the most dangerous time in the relationship for them. So we see that the likelihood of getting killed or seriously injured by their partner increases, like, I can't remember the statistics, but it's like tenfold for the 6 months surrounding leaving. So when they're planning to leave and after they leave. It is when the most women are more murdered by their partners, is when they leave. And so there's some real danger there. And we do not belittle that, because often a woman is very aware of her situation and may be staying because that feels like the safest option. And sometimes she may be correct that that is the safest option. There's a belief that their partner might change, that they can affect their partner in a positive way. You know, it's someone that they fell in love with, and they would like to change who they are, and often they believe they can. There's pressure from society. A lot of times we see this in religious communities where divorce is not looked on fondly, and we also see it when the abuse is not recognized from the outside, which often abusers can tend to be very social, gregarious, charming people. And the abuse can be kept quite private. So there can be some questioning from the community that way. There's a lot of fear that they won't be believed. And this comes from the fact that often they are not. So believing people who come forward and talk about abuse and giving them the respect to acknowledge their situation is really important. There can be fear of change. You know, a lot of times leaving an abusive relationship means changing your job, changing your location, changing your children's school, changing the way you make your money, changing where you live, changing your entire social community. It's huge. It can be really, really, really tough. And then there's the low self-esteem that's created by being in a relationship that's abusive. So a lot of times people don't know that they deserve better. They don't know that they can look forward to anything that's better than this in the future. We also see people who really love their abuser, and so they have mixed feelings. They want the abuse to stop, but they want to stay with their partner. We see a lot of people who are completely financially dependent on an abusive partner and do not know how they would survive without that. We see threats of physical harm, stalking, again, which is a huge problem and very, very, very terrifying for the people who are dealing with it. And then we see isolation. They may not have any other positive or close relationships in their life. A lot of times people who have been in abusive relationships for a long time have had all of their other supportive communities cut off. So they may not have anybody else in their life. They may not have a friend. Their family may very understandably have gotten tired of dealing with trying to get them out and no longer in contact with them, right? We see a lot of people who've sort of exhausted their supportive community by the end of these relationships. So I think I have time to do this. I'm just gonna look at the time. I'd like to show you this video that I find really effective that was started by a survivor. It was a Twitter campaign to talk about this issue of why did I stay in this relationship. It's a pretty quick video. I may not take you through the whole thing, but let me switch. I think I have to stop my screen share and start a new one. So hold on just a second. Okay. So are you seeing that private violence video now? Yes, good, awesome. Here you go.
It is the question that I'm asked the most. Why did I stay? Why does any woman stay? And for the life of me, I can't understand why people are obsessed with it, because to me, it's so obvious. Why does anybody stay with somebody that they love? You know, we've all been in relationships that, even if they weren't abusive, we're not working any longer. And we all stay far longer than we want. And you stay for the same reasons. You stay because you love the person, or you love what you used to have, or you're trying to take care of your children.
When we ask, why did you stay? We're blaming the victim for their abuse, as opposed to asking, why did you hit this person? Or why are you violent? Or why do you feel the need to be violent?
Why would somebody abuse? Why would somebody beat the people who love him or her most on earth? Until we ask that question, we won't be able to obliterate domestic violence. We have got to focus on the perpetrators of violence, not the victims.
It's cliche, but he really was Prince Charming. He was very kind and sweet and nice. I left what I was doing to come and be with him, and I was alone with him. I didn't have any friends or family in the area. I couldn't find a job, so he paid the bills. And so we got into an argument, and that's the first time that he hit me. He actually threw me up against the wall and started to choke me. And I didn't really understand what was happening because he was not that person all this time. And so when he finally let me go, I thought it was something I did. I wasn't thinking to run. After we got married, it didn't stop. It just got worse and worse and worse. And I felt like I was trapped. At that point, we had moved from where we were across the country again. And I was further isolated. I didn't have any friends or family. And essentially, he still was the breadwinner. I was dependent on him. So if I left, what was I going to do? Where was I going to go? How was I going to take care of myself? I felt like no one would understand. And I felt like no one would care.
The first full-out physical attack was 5 days before the wedding. Part of me knew I had to leave him right then, that I couldn't marry somebody who had done this. But then this other part of me said, but wait, it was one time. And I told myself he'd never do it again, that I was sure he was very sorry, and I didn't leave. I married him. You stayed with this guy.
Yeah, I didn't have a choice. I mean, he told me, and I absolutely, that's the part that it always it's so interesting to me. It's like, the standard question: why did you leave? Why did you leave? Why did you leave? Well, he was trained by the United States Marine Corps to hunt people down and kill them, and he told me if I left, he would hunt me down and kill me. That's why I didn't leave. I used to pull what he would call my disappearing acts, and that would be I would, get the boys and get out because it just was getting too intense. But I would always go back because at least I knew where he was. At least I knew the routine. I knew what to expect. But, it's a terrible way to live, to always be looking over your shoulder. He didn't start out with being abusive. He started out with being incredibly sweet and incredibly attentive and incredibly thoughtful and incredibly kind and saying things to me that no one had ever said and paying attention to me in ways that no one ever had. And I was really taken by it.
One of the reasons why we stay is because the behavior is such a drastic change from the person we met in the beginning. And we're constantly looking for the man in the beginning instead of concentrating on the man that is in front of us. Once I understood that, then I made the decision, I gotta go. This is not the same man I married. I mean, I love him, but he's gonna kill me.
With every violent moment, I felt further connected to him in this kind of twisted way. I felt that, we had this secret that bound us together and that this was something big and we were working on it. And so we had to stay together until we worked it out. The violence got to a point where I realized that I could die. I had to create a plan. I had to figure out where I was going to go and how I was going to get there and who I was going to reach out to for help if there was any. I was scared. I was afraid that he would find me. I was afraid that he would be so angry that I left that he would come after me. I couldn't just get up and walk away.
And it was the most terrible feeling to know that I could leave and I still couldn't leave because I was bound by this psychological trap that I thought was love, that wasn't love. I had so much denial. If you had come to me and said, are you being physically abused? If my doctor had asked me or a best friend, I would have said, no, I'm not being physically abused.
You do feel isolated and you keep a lot of secrets. You keep a lot of secrets in your heart, in your home, in your head. I stayed because I believed him when he said he wasn't going to do it again. I stayed because I didn't have anywhere to go. I didn't have any money. I didn't have access to any resources. I stayed because my religious community convinced me that I couldn't get divorced because God would hate me. I stayed because I loved him. I stayed because he was the love of my life. And I wanted to believe that love could conquer all, including abuse.
So I really like that video because I think it encapsulates, many of the reasons I was just talking about in terms of like what makes it so hard for women to leave and men to leave these relationships. And one of the quotes, it's actually one of the printed quotes on Twitter that I think about a lot is, it's not one day he hits you, it's every day he works to make you feel smaller. And I do think that that is a big part of this, right? So someone who's experienced abuse, especially if it's not the first time, if they grew up in an abusive relationship, in an abusive family, and maybe they've been in a few abusive relationships, which we do see, the self-esteem that they have can be so low that they really just genuinely don't believe that they deserve better. So we really work to increase their understanding of their self-worth and work towards helping our clients be their own best self-advocates. I think that's sort of at base what we are hoping will happen when people come into services, is that we'll be able to teach them to advocate for themselves and know that they deserve to be treated well. So a couple things, just some pointers on how to help someone if you're a little worried about them. Listen without judgment. So people are terrified of being judged for being in this situation. And if you can listen to them and not judge their situation and just hear what's going on, acknowledge that it's scary, that it's difficult, that it must be really hard, express concern for their safety. And you can do this in a non-judgmental way. You can say, I'm really worried for your safety and the safety of your children. And you don't deserve to be unsafe. You deserve to feel safe. Is there anything I can do to help? And then accepting their decisions. So what we see is people in violent relationships are consistently disempowered. So telling them they're dumb for staying, or, I mean, that's an extreme example, but honestly, it happens a lot. If they are making a decision for themselves, you have to respect that. We can always push them towards things that we think would be helpful. We can offer them resources. We can encourage them to take advantage of the help that's out there. But ultimately, it is their life, and they know it better than us. And we do encourage them to seek help. So, give them our number, give them the hotline number. Talk about place, do they have a church, maybe a pastor they can talk to? A lot of times that can be helpful. I am hoping, to connect with a lot of our faith communities around here, because I think it's where people seek help first often. And it's really good to have pastors and other faith leaders be informed about what the dynamics of these kinds of relationships are. And then just a few sentences I like people to think about and maybe memorize because they're very helpful is, I'm afraid for your safety. I'm afraid for the safety of your children. It will only get worse. So this is something we see. The cycle of violence escalates. It might start with just a little bit here and there. Over time, it always escalates. It is just something we see over and over again. So what comes into us is just, as emotional abuse can end up 5 years later being emotional, physical, psychological, and financial abuse, and more extreme physical abuse than there was before. Oh, and I forgot the last two. I'm here for you. That's very important. They do need community that's healthy. So you can't just take them away from their partner. You have to offer them relationships that are supportive, right? So we try and offer them a community of resources, but you can do that as a friend. You can say, I'm here for you. I'm ready to listen. I'm ready to try and offer assistance, and I'm not going to judge you. And you don't deserve to be abused. Nobody deserves to be abused, no matter what that person's, vision of themselves is, no matter what their failures are. People are imperfect. That doesn't make them deserving of abuse. So children in DV and IPV situations, I'm going to go through this quickly because I recognize that I'm sort of running out of time and I want to make sure I get to your questions. But what we see is that children are really, they're on a continuum. So, some are really resilient in these situations, and some have significant trauma from the situations that they're in or that they witness. A lot of times that can depend on their protective factors. I highlighted that one main protective factor is having a really strong supportive relationship with an adult in your life, because I imagine that some of you are that person for the children you're working with, right? This is extremely important. One of the reasons I think that my stepdad was able to be so resilient in his life was that while his father was very, very abusive towards his mother and towards the children, his mother was an extremely devoted, loving, and centered parent, despite all of that. And so that gave him enough of a sense of self and a sense of deserving that he had this resilience to pull himself out of that and not to recreate the behavior in his adulthood, right? So being that person for someone is such a service. And I just want to emphasize that. So a couple of pillars of how we work with children. We always establish the responsibility of the adult violence. So this is not their fault. Often children will think it's their fault. It is not their fault. The violence is the responsibility of the adults in this situation, right? You don't do anything to create it, and you don't do anything to deserve it. Address their issues of shame and isolation. So often children who are witnessing domestic violence feel very isolated. They don't want to tell anybody what's going on. They're ashamed of their family dynamics. So we're going to try and help them with that feeling, get them to open up a little bit. No, again, that's related to, it's not your fault. You didn't create this situation and you're not responsible for it, right? Safety plan. So if there's violence going on in the household, how can they stay safe? Where can they go? That is a safe space. Reminding them not to get involved in physical violence is really important, especially for young men. We see that a lot of, especially teenage men, will be at risk of committing violence in defense of their parent who's being abused, or also get hurt while trying to intervene in these situations. Just getting them to talk about their feelings to someone who's going to listen and not judge and not discount their experiences. And then teaching them healthy conflict resolution skills, because they probably haven't seen those modeled for them, right? So in order for them to have healthy relationships in the future, we're going to really proactively work with them to talk about what is a healthy relationship. How do you healthily and happily and equally resolve a conflict, as opposed to trying to beat someone into submission. And then building their self-esteem. So these are the things that we try and do with all the children who come into our care. Just a quick little thing that I think is important for remembering for kids. We always teach them the safe. So to stay out of the fight, like I just mentioned, to avoid getting trapped. So we talk to them about, and this is, all ages of children, but you want to find a safe space, but you also don't want to find a space that you can't get out of. So we're going to strategize with them where they can be if they're witnessing violence that is going to keep them out of harm's way. We encourage them to find a phone, call 911, or to find help. So, if there's a neighbor or a friend or someone else they can call. And then escape. So if there's violence going on in the house, get out if you can. If there's a safe neighbor, that's a really great resource, and we'll try and identify who are those safe people for children that they can seek help with. I just wanted to talk about trauma-informed principles quite quickly, because we work with these principles at the base of all of our work, and I think it's important to talk about, because it also speaks to a little bit why we work proactively with women and men who are in abusive relationships to try and create a healthy situation for their children instead of just immediately trying to get the children out of the family, right? We want to create a safe space for everyone. We want there to be peer support, trustworthiness, and transparency in our work. So we're going to be honest about what we can provide. We're going to be honest with the kids about what we can do and not do. And we want there to be some collaboration and mutuality. A lot of times the best thing for the family is going to be for the kids to be able to stay with their parents. Often kids actually have a fine relationship with the abusive parent, and the abuse is solely between the adults, right? So we don't want to destroy the healthy relationships that they have, but we do want to talk about the dynamics that are troubling and keep them safe. We want our clients to have power, to feel empowered, to have a voice, to have choice in their situation. That includes the adult clients we work with and their children, right? So we're going to listen to what the children are saying, what they need, what they want. And then we're going to try and take into consideration what are the other cultural and historical contexts we're working within. So is this someone who comes from, a significantly impoverished community, where the behavior, or access to resources is kind of low, and, abusive behavior is the norm. It's maybe run in their family, things like that, so that we can work from that knowledge base to help them and start from where they are now, not where we hope they'd be. That was not the most articulate explanation of that, but we try and start from like where the client is now. What can we do to help you now? Baby steps are helpful, right? So who are we and what are our missions and services? I'm going to jet through this really quick, but so we work with to end domestic violence in our community. That's our goal. And hopefully at some point, none of us will have a job because we will have achieved it. Our philosophy is that we are committed to providing a safe, supportive, confidential, and respectful environment for all survivors, and give them the skills that they need to make informed decisions for themselves and their families. So we work with everyone in the community, regardless of gender, resources, immigration status, anything. All of our services are free and they're all confidential. The only thing that would violate that, or that would change that confidentiality, is if someone reports to us an intention to harm themselves or others, or child abuse. In our case, child abuse, the legal term of like child abuse neglect can include being a witness to domestic violence. In our case, we're gonna assume that if the parent is seeking resources with us, they're already working to remedy that. And unless we see active abuse with the safe parent, then we kind of work within our services to address that before going to CPS. That does not mean that we don't go to CPS, but we are not mandated reporters because of the dynamic of the way that children are often used in abusive relationships. It's assumed if someone's working with our services, they're already working towards a healthy, constructive solution. Of course, if we see behavior that challenges that, we will address it. And we do have a dedicated child advocate who works very closely with all the children and teens who come into our program. And she works with the parents to work on parenting skills and to support them in their goals for creating a healthy family. So some of the services we have a 24-hour crisis hotline. It's staffed all day long, every day, holidays and all. We have an emergency shelter. We offer resource assistance. So a lot of times with domestic violence, there's a significant lack of financial resources. So a lot of times our clients are coming in to get basic needs met: diapers, grocery cards, household cleaning supplies, things like that. And we can offer that to people working with us, which is great. We offer supportive counseling through the Women's Initiative. We partner with them and have a dedicated counselor who works with our clients. And we also offer outreach counseling. So if someone calls the hotline and would like to speak to someone and doesn't necessarily want to come in for shelter, but maybe wants to have a regular appointment talking to someone on the phone about their situation, we can offer that. We offer legal advocacy, which is, we don't have lawyers on staff, but we can accompany people to court when they're seeking protective orders, when they're going through custody procedures, or anything else where they might need a supportive person in the room. We have programs for children and teens. We have a dedicated Spanish-speaking advocate and also other Spanish-speaking services for our immigrant and Spanish-speaking community. We have an address confidentiality program for people who want to keep their new location secret if they're leaving a relationship. And then we have a pet safe program. A lot of times pets are used similarly to children in abusive relationships, where the pet's safety is threatened as a way of controlling the partner. So we can offer them a space to bring their fur baby in with them, which I have a fur baby and I really appreciate. So we also offer this kind of thing: prevention and education in the community, training other professionals who may be adjacent to these issues, volunteer opportunities. And in all of our work, all of the time, we are safety planning with our clients to keep them as safe as possible and their families as safe as possible in whatever situation they're in. So this is some just basic safety plan information that I like to include. And Randy will send out a smaller version of this PowerPoint. So this is mostly for you to have. If you're ever in a situation where you're trying to help someone increase their safety, these are some really good tips. Programming 911 into their cell phone, knowing the shelter's hotline so that they can call for assistance in a crisis situation and not have to look it up on Google. Not getting trapped in the kitchen or the bathroom. This is one that's really kind of new to people outside of the work and very important. Bathrooms tend to be small and there's a lot of things you can hit your head on. It's easy to get trapped in there. Kitchens tend to have a lot of sharp objects that can be used as weapons. So we encourage people to stay out of those areas when conflicts are occurring actively. Knowing your routes of egress out of the house, the door that might be unlocked, the quickest way to get out if you are threatened. And then, keeping some key things easily accessible: car keys, some cash if you need to leave, suddenly, making sure that people keep their important documents safe, ID. We have a lot of clients who come in without ID because their abuser has destroyed it, or keeps it, and that can create problems. I mean, we'll work with them to get a new one, but it's really hard to function in this world, to get a job, things like that, if you don't have your important documentation. So if they can possibly keep that safe, it's a good idea. So I'm going to talk about how COVID has affected our work, and then I'm going to move to Q&A so we have time for it, because I'm totally running over. Sorry, y'all. Basically, COVID has exacerbated a lot of issues that always make domestic violence worse. Risk factors like isolation, unemployment, substance use, financial and emotional stress. These are things that escalate already violent situations. It's not going to create a violent situation out of thin air, but if there is a tendency towards domestic violence, it makes it worse. So we are seeing an increase in need. It has decreased our emergency shelters capacity because we need to create ability for people to be safe around COVID and socially distance. So we've gone from about a 25-person capacity to just around 10 to 15, depending. We can have 10 adults with their children at this time. So we're working towards increasing that again, but it's the sad truth. A lot of our in-person services are now remote, which is just not great when you're dealing with people who have complex trauma and are already feeling isolated. So we're still offering all of our same services, but I think we're all eager to get back to in-person counseling and things, because being able to offer that person, a real person in the room, is it's just very valuable. And it's also impacted people's willingness to seek medical help. It's impacted our ability to use volunteers in our work. And as everybody I'm sure knows, it's impacted the whole financial community. So other agencies that we work with for support are all having the same sort of kind of cash strap negative effects as well. So it has made it more complicated and a little tougher. We are really proud to have maintained all of our services throughout COVID. None of them have been shut down. But it's presented some challenges. So I'm going to go ahead and stop screen sharing, and I'll share the rest of this with you in that presentation that Randy sends out afterwards, but I want to make sure I get to questions. So go ahead, fire them at me.
So you have one here asking about supports and treatment for the perpetrator.
Sure.
It was clear through, the cycle that there's going to be reconnecting, and it could happen up to 7 to 12 times, I think you had stated. So what treatment options are out there? What works, what doesn't work? How do we support relationships that are going to stay together?
Sure. So we don't really work directly with perpetrators here. We're very victim focused or survivor focused. That is not to say we don't sometimes work with perpetrators, because a lot of times an abusive relationship goes both ways. So we may have someone who engages in abusive behavior and also receives it, right? What I will say is, in our community, there are some sort of court mandated type of perpetrator courses that kind of try and build their relationship skills and their conflict resolution skills so that they aren't resorting to violence when they have a conflict. Those I know about through our connections with the kind of parole officer community. And a lot of times, if someone is convicted of a violent offense, most domestic violence offenses are misdemeanors, but they can be kind of ordered to complete a course like that. And it can be helpful. I don't have stats on the success of kind of perpetrator engagement. But what I will say is that I have a healthy skepticism of it, just because there is a high recidivism rate in this kind of thing, and it is a strongly learned behavior. That's not to say that someone can't change and can't end the cycle. One thing we don't do, and we recommend against, is couples counseling in abusive relationships. And that's because individual counseling can be quite helpful, but couples counseling can be weaponized. So like things that are shared in that space can be weaponized. Also, it's not usually very effective in terms of helping the person experiencing the abuse. And it can also often be sort of, can make people stay in a relationship because they think it's being worked on, when in fact there's no real constructive change. That's not a very great answer to your question, but the truth is I don't actually have a lot of information on perpetrators, because that's not the focus of our work.
Quick question, sorry to interrupt. So
No.
I actually posted that question, and I realized that you guys are definitely victim oriented, and I get that, and I appreciate that about you. I just, recollect when you talking about your stepfather situation, et cetera, and realizing what helped break that cycle, right? And so
Yeah.
I feel if we know that they're going to continue to go back to, 7 to 12 times and maybe never ever leave, how do you, like, I understand that that kind of is not in your department, but I think that preventative is also important. And so I heard you say we work with the kids and try to show them, that what they're learning is not appropriate. But how can you, is there any way, is that some type of discussion that can be had about working with that abuser to help them understand, because a lot of these are it stems from their own traumas a lot of times in itself. And so I've found in my personal experience, and I'm nowhere near you, granted, I will say that, but in dealing with domestic violence, when you're able to kind of work with someone through their own traumas, that you then may be able to see a change.
Yeah.
So is there any type of resources that you guys can even start discussing? Like how can we help that person who is the abuser? Because we're going to continue this cycle otherwise.
Yeah. So there definitely are community resources for people who are seeking to kind of change their abusive behavior. A lot of them are through, I'm blanking on the name of the organization, but I'll make sure that I put a link in the follow-up email for you. We do have a lot of prevention work in our organization. It's not necessarily perpetrator focused. It's kind of earlier than that. It's primary prevention. So we have actually a dedicated preventionist on our staff, which is really lucky and fairly unique. So rah, rah for that grant. She's wonderful. And she goes into primarily younger communities. So starting as early as, like elementary school, if they'll let her in, and talks about, positive relationships, conflict resolution, consent culture, sort of proactively teaches the skills that make violence in a relationship feel unnecessary, because you have better skills to resolve your conflicts and get your needs met, right? That is the goal. We understand that in a lot of these cases, it's a culture that has taught people to feel entitled to certain things that they aren't entitled to, and also left them with no tools to address when they have a need or an emotion that is overwhelming and not being addressed, right? So our preventionist works to create those skills early on. And there are places in the community where adults who don't have those skills can go. And I will try and get a few of those and include them in the follow-up email. I can't get them off the top of my head, unfortunately, for you. I agree with everything you said, though. We do see that the intergenerational cycle of trauma is part of the problem for both perpetrators and victims. And one of the reasons we work so closely with children is because, witnessing abuse in your childhood puts you at a risk for perpetrating as well as experiencing the violence in the future. So our work in and of itself, trying to interrupt that cycle, hopefully is preventative for future generations. But yeah, no, it's very important to work with perpetrators. It's not what we do. There are resources in our communities. There is, if you're interested in further reading, there's an excellent book called No Visible Bruises, which I'll also try and include in the chat. And that is primarily about domestic violence as a public health issue. It's excellently written by a journalist who it's very narratively easy to follow, but she has a close study of some perpetrator programs in that you might find interesting, actually. She follows someone in California who was a perpetrator himself, started a perpetrator sort of like behavior modification program, and she talks about the issues that come up in that very well and quite extensively. So I'll include that in the email too.
We have a question from Pat. How do you deal with cultural differences? For example, male dominant role in decision making. Also, what about languages other than Spanish?
Great question. So we function on a model of cultural humility, which if you're not familiar with, it's a little different than cultural competence. We recognize that we're not going to know everything about someone's background or the culture that they're coming from, and that, different cultures are valid and all of those things. When, and we kind of work to address our own assumptions about what is right, based on cultural differences. But what I would say with male dominant, like traditionally male dominant cultures, is a lot of times we're just going to be talking to that person from where they're at, so you can have a relationship where it's sort of the man of the house is in charge, and that's sort of a cultural comfort level for both of you that's not abusive. Just because there's a head of household assumption does not mean that there should be abuse involved. In fact, actually, somebody who's a healthy head of household should be protecting and nurturing everyone within their care. So we'll try and emphasize that. We also just understand that, some people come from communities where the gender balance in relationships is different. We'll deal with people who have different beliefs about, divorce and separating a relationship. All of that is fine, right? So, and we are not going to judge your cultural or religious beliefs. We're just going to encourage you to work within them to not receive abuse. because a belief that a man should be in charge doesn't mean that the man should abuse, right? And with language services, we have a translation line, so we can get access to pretty much any language we need to on the hotline. And there will be simultaneous translation by a live person for that hotline call. We are working on right now addressing the needs of the deaf and hard of hearing community. We do have the ability to have translation for that community, but there are a lot of needs within that community that need to be addressed better. So we actually have a person who's on this webinar. I see her name down there, Laura, who is on a grant researching the needs within that community and how we can better address them. So we're working towards that. But with the languages, basically, we have that translation line, and then we can get them involved if that person wants ongoing services as well. What I will say is with the Spanish-speaking community, we find that a lot of times they seek outreach services, but are less likely to want to use our emergency shelter and more likely to want to set up a situation in which they're in a friend's house or a family's house that is a safe space for them, but where it is a primarily Spanish-speaking place. So we'll try and help support them finding that safe solution if they're, not wanting to come into shelter. Does that answer your question? Awesome.
All right. Well, we've kind of gone through our time today.
Sorry.
It was very enjoyable. I mean, as I said when I opened, Piedmont Casa served 242 kids last year, and 126 of them have experienced or witnessed domestic violence in their life. And I think that just shows the prevalence in our community and the need for awareness and education and support and therapy for the survivors of this. So I thank you, Liesel, for coming to us today. And I think you're going to put a link in the chat for an evaluation that I also will send out.
Yes, I am grabbing that link now, and we'll put it in the chat. And if you all could take it's a very short evaluation, and it helps us a lot in terms of, it helps me so that I can, improve my presentations, but it also helps us report for grants on how we're reaching the community. So if you can take the few seconds it takes to fill that out, I would greatly appreciate it. I'm copying the link now. And then the other thing I would say is, in the follow-up email, I'll also put it in the chat. I'm putting my email address. And so if you had a question that wasn't addressed watched today and you'd like to talk a little bit more, please go ahead and reach out. That's what I'm here for. And I would love to answer it and not just ignore it because I went over on presentation and we left too little Q&A time. So that is my email. And I would love to hear from any and all of you. Also, you can shoot me an email if you're interested in learning about opportunities to volunteer with the shelter, because I also do our volunteer training and coordination.
Well, thank you once again. And everybody, our next presentation will be on May 12th, and we are still ironing out some of the details of it. So thank you once again, and thank everybody from the community and volunteers for joining this presentation. I hope everybody gets a chance to get outside and enjoy the beautiful weather today. So
thank you for this opportunity. I appreciate it.
thank you all. We'll see you later.
Bye.
Yeah.